Whenever I'm strutting down the street like Tony Manero from today's topic, Saturday Night Fever, inevitably I'm stopped and asked, what exactly is a primary source versus a secondary source? I tell the person, whoever stops me, a primary source is from a subject, while a secondary source is about it. So they'll say, Saturday Night Fever is a secondary source because it's about disco. And I'll say, no, it's a document of the age of disco and therefore a primary source. After all, in my opinion, everything is a primary source. John Travolta is attached to two movies that define the 1970s, 1977's Saturday Night Fever, and the following year's Grease. The former is an icon of the age of disco, and therefore contemporary of its time, while the latter speaks to the feelings of nostalgia that ran and continues to run deep in American culture during a rather dark period in which it was released. Neither film is simple. Saturday Night Fever is not just a disco movie, and Grease isn't just about 1950s high school hot rodding. These elements come together to make both pictures, and Travolta's developing film career, outstanding documents of their era. I recently connected with Kevin Higgins, the host of I Help Make That, a podcast which gives voice to people who create our favorite TV shows and movies. And at his suggestion, we went forward with dissecting Saturday Night Fever as a document of its era. Welcome back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I am Eric Paul, and I'm joined today by Kevin Higgins, who is also a podcaster. I've found, I don't know about you, Kevin, but when we podcast, those who are familiar with the medium are sometimes the best guests because you know how to make good conversation out of, in this case, media. Your show is called I Help Make That, and it's all about people who have a role. Basically, in the credits of any movie or TV show, we'd find their name, right?
Yeah, so I interview the person specifically about what their role was in the movie or TV show. Sometimes we talk about a whole movie, a whole TV show, or even just one episode of a TV show.
I really love that deep dive into, and I know that's probably an overused expression, deep dive, deep dive. You hear it all the time for podcasting, but I really like it because there's always a story behind the story when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to everything out there that we consume. And I think we're at a stage now in our culture that we have a lot more investigating to do.
Yeah, that's actually kind of why I decided to start this podcast because I was kind of sick of videos from people who have no actual experience in the entertainment industry, just sort of making wild guesses about about how and why movies turned out the way they did,
Mm-hmm.
good or bad.
Do you have a connection to the entertainment industry? Are you a filmmaker or a TV person?
Well, I am a podcast producer, but I do also know several people in the entertainment industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also an actor, mainly background actor, and I am a podcast talent booker.
That sounds like such, especially the background work.
Mhm.
That's what my dream. I want so badly for my entire life. I love, and I don't know if you've heard some of my other more recent episodes. I talk about this. That when, because I watch media, I watch TV shows, movies over and over again. It's just kind of like what I do. And each time I tell myself, I'm like, this time I'm going to watch that the people in the background because there's a whole other preparation involved in that, isn't there, when you're working in the background?
Yeah, there is. I will say it's actually fairly easy depending on where you are. You can just sign up and you'll get
Yeah.
notifications asking for background work. Where do you live?
I live in New Hampshire, so we don't have a lot of movies or TV shows made here. Boston seems to be the closest that I get. Occasionally I'll see like an all call for a couple years ago. They had, or last year, Hocus Pocus 2 was filming in Salem. So they wanted, but it was a whole big you really had to commit to it for like a couple days, and I just couldn't do
Mhm.
that. But are you East Coast, West Coast, or?
I live in New York, and today's movie was actually filmed in New York. And because there's a lot of club scenes, if you ever have seen this movie,
Yeah,
you'll definitely know some people who look like wild characters in the background. It's kind of hard not to notice
right.
the background actors in this particular movie. I actually talked about this on an episode of a podcast of mine when I was interviewing another background actor who was in Mommy Dearest. But
Oh, wow.
in the climactic scene, because we were talking about background acting,
Mhm.
I actually used Saturday Night Fever as an example of an extra who stands out. Because in the scene where John Travolta and his love interest are dancing and More Than a Woman plays on in the background, there's an extra right behind them, like when she's like dipping down,
Yeah.
who's like scratching his nose. Then they go away, and the next time you see him, he's like standing right up here, like in a I didn't do anything position.
Huh. So there's probably something going on there that he probably knows as the extra,
Yeah,
and the rest of us can only guess.
yeah, he probably just didn't recognize he was on camera
Right. Well, I
until
mean,
it's too late.
when you're doing that kind of work, is it always like, are you cognizant the whole time of like, okay, when they said cut, I was doing this, so when they roll again, I need to be in a similar position?
Most of the time, it really depends on. Well, the ADs are the ones who, are who interact with the extras. It's never
Right.
like the director. So it really depends on how well the AD explains things. But most of the time, I would say I am cognizant of that.
Yeah. I'm going to actually do my best at uh, putting things together to segue to our topic tonight, and that is Saturday Night Fever. And a lot of times when I talk with guests and prospective guests for the show, we go back and forth, trying to find the right topic, the right piece of pop culture to go over as a conversation. You didn't hesitate with Saturday Night Fever. Is there a reason why?
Basically because it was just a movie I wanted to talk about the themes of and sort of how the soundtrack ties into the
Mm-hmm.
themes, like, just talk about overall as a movie. I had actually been trying to do an episode of it on I Helped Make That,
Mm-hmm.
but none of the actors were either available or interested that I could reach out to, and
Yeah,
who actually, got back to me.
because when you look at the cast list of John Travolta, and I say that because when I think Saturday Night Fever, I just think John Travolta. Like, it's like he and that movie are like symbiotic. They're like the
Oh
same.
yeah.
They're together like that. So when I think of both or either, when I think of the film, you get like him as the iconic figure of the movie, the main character. And then there's some other actors that kind of, haven't done much else. But then there's like Fran Drescher is on the cast
Mm-hmm.
list, and she's
Yeah.
certainly had more of a career.
Yeah. Yeah. No offense to Karen Lynn Gorney, but I find it wild that she was like the female lead in this movie,
Mm.
and then she literally didn't act again for 14 years.
It is an interesting dynamic in a way, because the movie, and I think that's a good place to um, slide into the material it's made from, because it was an ultimate product of its time. Disco was huge
Yeah.
when
Mm-hmm.
the movie came out, and it seemed like only a matter of time before a disco themed film was going to be showing up in the theaters. So for those of you maybe listening for the first time to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the EPS podcast for short, what we do here is we treat things like movies, in this case Saturday Night Fever, the same way that a museum, or an archaeologist would treat their findings, their primary sources, their ways of the past speaking to them. So, in my opinion, movies, TV shows, music, all of that is just as valid to tell you about the time period as anything else. And so we have a series of questions that we go through, and these will be our conversation pieces. So, besides disco, what else would you say is the material of Saturday Night Fever?
Well, I would say that, and I don't know exactly if this was the filmmaker's intent, but besides just disco and showing off the soundtrack, to me, it seemed like the movie was trying to sort of like the macho masculine culture of the 70s in a similar way that Taxi Driver was actually a year beforehand, trying to make some sort of commentary on how when people try too hard to be sort of this big tough guy, sort of this like big hero, or like how you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, the movie is actually a lot grittier than the surface of it. The cover of most of the posters, you see Travolta striking the disco point pose and the disco ball behind him and light up floor. And if you don't watch it, you just kind of assume, oh, it's a whole movie of dancing and it's fun. But no, it has some gritty themes to it.
Yeah, it's a gritty, dramatic movie, sort of about hero worship, like overt masculinity, because toxic masculinity wasn't a term then. Tony Manero is basically this dumb kid,
right,
who thinks he's like Sylvester Stallone, Al Pacino, Bruce Lee, thinks he's this hot shit, and sort of as the movie goes on, he kind of realizes just how much of a dumbass he really is, how much he is like pretty much nothing like those people, and how kind of awful the world really is around him.
I want to take this opportunity. I'm going to skip down to the question. We don't have to go in the order of these, and I think it really needs to be discussed here about the where was it made and the ideas and behavior that it conveys. So it's a New York movie. It's set in New York, the 70s. I wasn't alive then, but my parents,
me neither,
they lived in New York, and they went to school in New York in the early 70s. And that whole decade and that city are kind of known for its pretty dark time for New York. It wasn't easy to live there. Rampant crime. A lot of people fled the actual city itself. Flight to the suburbs, and so there was it was a pretty rough place, a pretty tough place. And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the actual club scenes are in Manhattan, but Tony doesn't live in Manhattan, does he?
No, he lives in Brooklyn.
Yeah, with his parents, right? He's not he kind of almost always wants to, and that's why I think the behavior of it, there's like a transformation that happens for him when he goes out disco dancing. He gets that opportunity to, nobody knows what my home life is like. They don't know what I'm actually like. I'm transforming by going over the bridge to the city.
Yeah, that's like the thing. It's sort of like the club is sort of a place where he can feel like he is this sort of macho hero. He like really hopes to be like that. He really thinks of himself as.
And is that something that you think could only have been that story with that component to it, the disco itself? I don't see that happening in any previous time period. The 60s didn't quite have the disco. They had like, the go-go dancing place. I just think of like Austin Powers Pad, kind of look to it. I don't think there was much with the 50s. So previous time periods, there was dance halls in the 40s and the 30s and going all the way back. But, disco is so much different as a music form than those other ones, where it's not live music, it's not even out of a jukebox. There's like DJs involved. There's, they might have a live singer, but a lot of these clubs, it's like just here's, the DJ booth. So the musicians, the music itself, they're not the centerpiece of these clubs. There's no dancers on stage. It's the actual dance floor itself. That's where people almost kind of prove their self and strut around, right? The opening of the movie is iconic just for that reason. He's strutting down the street.
Yeah, like if you think about it, when you listen to the music of the movie, like almost every song, if you listen to the lyrics, they actually help illustrate what is going on in Tony's life at that point in time.
Yeah.
Like, Stayin Alive, like going nowhere, somebody help me, because he's like basically this aimless person who's just, like, he looks confident, but if you just take the tune by itself, it doesn't sound that bad. It doesn't sound that down spirit. How do I say this? It doesn't sound like a downer of a song, but if you actually listen to the lyrics, like it's kind of like an interesting juxtaposition, which of sort of upbeats of an upbeat, like an upbeat tempo and downbeat lyrics, which kind of shows that, he portrays this image of someone who acts like he has it all, but he really doesn't.
Yeah, he is very much wearing a mask almost, and it's very fitting. And I think that's why, the music, like you just said, and the poster, the marketing, the covers of things, it makes you think of an upbeat story and a happy thing, and it sounds very danceable. That the opening strains of Stayin Alive are probably the most catchy that you'll find from the era, but it doesn't take long to realize, oh, that's just a front. That's just kind of like himself, right? The character himself is putting out there this one appearance, but actually something deeper and much darker lurks below. And that's, I think, so telling of the time period. I think about the late 1970s and the other kinds of films that were coming out. You mentioned Taxi Driver. You had the Godfather movies, and other New York films. You had, I was talking earlier this season for my show with a gentleman who does a Star Wars podcast. We did Star Wars, and Star Wars is the exception to the rule in that era because it went back to basic good guy, bad guy storytelling. It didn't have like that French Connection-esque, kind of gray character of, you're not sure, the anti-hero. Are they good? Are they bad? Star Wars has elements of that with Han Solo, but the rest of the characters is very obvious. Luke Skywalker, good. Darth Vader, bad. You don't have those elements of, I don't know, what's he going to do next? Whereas so many of the other movies before and after Star Wars did struggle with that identity. And I really feel like that is something that if you pull back from the era, it's not just in the movies, it's in the music, it's everywhere, because the whole country was really struggling with that identity crisis that is presented in so many of the movies. When it comes to, so we can go back up, the director of the movie. Now, in your opinion, and you've talked to a lot of people who, have a hand in making movies, everyone from actors to writers and different levels of cast members and producers. Who do you give credit to making a movie? When the question comes up, who likely makes it? Is it the director? Is it the writer? Is it the producer? In your opinion, who is it?
Well, it really depends on the movie, and how much, creative control, like the producers and studios give them. Like, and like, a more independent movie is usually, more so a director's vision. but studio films can go 50-50. But on the other hand, even the most creator-driven studio films, there's still a huge team working behind them, which is not to say that, with independent films, there's not a huge team as well, but there is it's sort of more usually of a close-knit team,
right,
kind of working together than it probably would be with a studio than it usually is with a studio film.
And where does Saturday Night Fever fall for that? Is it because I know that the director was John, I don't know how to pronounce it, Badham, who he had made actually a pretty wide spectrum of movies in his career. It wasn't always the same kind, and it was loosely based on a story, right, in that it had appeared in a magazine or newspaper a few years earlier at the height of disco. But the writer of the film, director, would they fall into that category of being creator driven, or was it a studio, let's get a movie out there about disco because people love disco?
Well, back in the 60s and 70s, there were more like creator driven movies. It was kind of called there's a term for it, for like movies from the 60s and 70s and even early 80s that were more creator driven, and then like
artard,
yeah,
like made by an artist rather than just somebody who was handed a slate and said, go make a movie.
Well, I don't think it's literally ever just that,
right,
or just that simple. So basically, throughout the 60s and 70s, there was usually more of a, even studio films are more creator driven. Then, have you ever heard of the movie Heaven's Gate?
I know the group that named themselves after that, but I don't know the movie necessarily.
So basically, Heaven's Gate was this movie from the late 70s, early 80s that directed by Michael Cimino, the director of The Deer Hunter.
Oh, right, yeah.
All right, and there was a lot of huge production troubles that happened during the set of the movie that caused it to go over budget. And it ended up being like a huge flop at the box office. And because of the bad press the movie got, it kind of helped steer back towards a studio having more control over movies than throughout the late 60s through the 70s, where there were more creator driven film productions.
And does that have something to do? I got to think that it has something to do with television arriving on the scene, because and we're seeing the same dynamic again now. TV and movies, the battle continues, and it seems like TV's winning again. That in the 2020s, where creators, movie makers, the visionary types are turning to television, premium TV, to make their stories rather than going to the movie theaters. Movies have kind of become, low culture in a way, whereas in the 70s, TV owned low culture. And it was the movies that you got the artistic films. And I think that has to be. And I know that the director of Saturday Night Fever did some TV and movies as well. But I got to say, I think that has to be why the story showed up the way that it did in the time that it did. It was filmed in that. In other words, the director seemed to care about the story. It wasn't just, a job. It was something that they wanted to make the right way. Would you agree with that?
For the most part, I would agree. I don't think in this case on TV, the battle between movies and TV had much to do with that. Especially because, by the 70s, TV had been around for like decades.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, I do. I think it's really just recently that TV has become like considered like high culture. Like, of course, there were like critically acclaimed TV shows
Yeah.
in the past, but I think it's really just been recently that like it is kind of overtaken, movies as sort of a more creator driven venue.
Mm-hmm. And with part of it, I think in the time period that we're speaking of, with Saturday Night Fever, and this might have a lot to do with why the soundtrack plays such a heavy role in it, is because home video was in its infancy. It really didn't even exist. It wasn't commercial. People couldn't access it. The very, very wealthy might be able to have some kind of home video access, but for most everybody, it was, you saw the movie in the theater. That's why the movies were, done. They put so much effort into them in the 70s, and they were for an older, more mature audience for the most part in the movies, because kids, they had their TV. They didn't have to go to the theater to get but the adults, they want to go out on a Saturday night. Maybe they have a fever, maybe they don't. They go out on a Saturday night, Friday night, date movie, dinner movie, that whole thing. But there's no way to take it home with you when you're done. Earlier this season, I did an on the spot interview, actually a pair of them. I do that with my podcast. I take it out to different places and I set up different artifacts on my table. And then if it catches somebody's eye, they talk about it. And it was right after Olivia Newton-John had passed away. So more than a few people latched onto my copy of the Grease record. And they said that exact same thing. They were both of the generation who saw Grease in the theater. And another John Travolta, post Welcome Back Kotter project. And they said, first of all, the movie was a lot raunchier than they expected it. And I'm sure their parents had no idea because of, the setting it's in, just like this disco movie. It's like, oh, it's the 50s. How bad can it be? Well, there's some sex and language and stuff in Greece. But then they said, because they watched in the theater as much as they could, but the record, the thing that I presented to them with, allowed them to take it home with them. They could listen to it over and over again. And because it goes in the same progression as the movies, the music in the movies, they could kind of imagine the movie in their mind. Do you think Saturday Night Fever had the same purpose for its soundtrack, that they wanted the Bee Gees front and center on there because they were hot contemporary artists, but also so that people, after the watch the movie, they can listen along to the movie basically on their record player?
Definitely. I definitely think that was their motivation, especially I would say I think it's the producer's motivation and the studio's motivation to have the soundtrack play a part in helping the movie retain its cultural impact.
Mm-hmm. That is, and you put it so well just then with the cultural impact component, because I feel like if people like you and I who weren't even alive in the 70s, let alone I know people who are a little bit older than me, but like born in the 70s, they don't remember any of it. When we're like learning about the 70s, like a history topic, inevitably Saturday Night Fever is like, the images from that are used to contextualize the 70s. If you're going to talk 70s, you got to talk disco. And if you're going to talk disco, you got to talk this movie, because they're one and the same, really. And so we get that image of Tony doing it was funny, actually. I'm a high school teacher, and earlier today early this week, a young man was walking into the class next to me, and he was showing off. He's like, "Look what I have!" And he had a record of Saturday Night Fever, and I'm like, I'm like, that's a coincidence because I'm going to do a podcast later this week about that. And he was like, I'm the king of disco now because I have this record. And he, started doing a dance move. And he said he got it. Somebody gave it to him as a Secret Santa gift or something like that. And he thought it was just the best. And then I saw him today. He was walking down the hall and he still had the record with him. It's kind of like his, he wants to show it off a little bit. So I knew he saw me, so I struck the pose. I got into the John Travolta, disco move. We've been doing that our whole lives. If you talk disco, you do that move. You think Stayin Alive. You think of, the white ensemble with the bell bottoms and the big collar and everything like that. It is such a cultural impact that it made. It's really, it's an icon of the time, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to say that. Yeah, I would agree with that.
When it comes to the section where, and this might actually piggyback right on with what you were just saying with the record itself, but the movie too. Why do you think, we've touched on this a little bit before, but why do you think they made it? And by they, I mean, everybody from the top down saying, why do you think Travolta got involved? Why do you think that the film company decided to go for this particular project? Why do you think they felt like, yep, we need to make Saturday Night Fever?
Well, I do know that it well, first off, to help, sell the soundtrack, and also, to help launch John Travolta into superstardom. But I do know that it was loosely based on an article written by this music writer named Nick Cohn that had premiered in New York Magazine.
Yeah.
And I think I'm pretty sure Robert Stigwood, I know he was the driving force behind this movie. He had read the article and he was inspired to make the movie and purchased the film rights to it.
Okay. And I mean, did they just assume that it was going to be a hit, that because disco was, so big that it was like, yeah, this is going to be a no-brainer. People will love this movie.
Well, again, because, it was a more creator-driven environment, at the time, I'm not sure they were they were hoping it would be a hit, but I'm sure I'm not entirely sure if Paramount knew whether or not they had a hit on their hands.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it was made for a relatively low budget of only $3.5 million.
Yeah, that's not that much, actually.
Yeah, at least not for a movie.
Right.
I would love to have $3.5 million.
Yes, I would be glad to find places to use that. But yeah, for a movie of that caliber, and I think that has something to do with Travolta's status at that time, right? Because if he had made any other picture as his career was taking off, he probably would have been $3.5 million a day for his profile to be attached to that.
Yeah, but as I was saying, I think they didn't think it was, I didn't think the studio thought it was too much of a risk, because they probably didn't think that even if it did underperform, that they would lose that much on it.
Yeah.
Due to the low budget.
Yeah. And also the record had to do, like you said at the start of this, of the question, it has to do with that too, because if they, the movie's one thing, but you can enjoy the album on its own. You don't need to have seen the movie to enjoy the music from the record. It really only supplements the movie. It doesn't, they're not necessary components to one another. On the contrary, it's fine. I always go back to Star Wars. It seems there's two topics I always go back to on my podcast: is Star Wars and Ninja Turtles, just constantly. But Star Wars, because it came out in the age of disco, before John Williams came on board as the composer for the soundtrack, and everything. They were like kind of assumed that, hey, space, there's gonna be lasers involved. The soundtrack's gonna be disco. We're not going to have classical music as the music to the film. So it's imagine Star Wars as purely a disco movie. Saturday Night Fever, on the other hand, it had to be disco music because that's the centerpiece of the story, but it could at the same time be enjoyed completely as its own form of music. That being said, it wasn't that much longer before they had that Death to Disco night at Comiskey Park in Chicago, where I'm sure more than a few of these Saturday Night Live, I keep saying Saturday Night Live, Saturday Night Fever albums ended up in the bonfire that night because of its iconic status. Superficially, Saturday Night Fever is the ultimate product of the 1970s because of its discotheque backdrop. I can't think of a single pop culture retrospective that doesn't make sure to include at least one image attached to the film or its soundtrack. And for most of us who did not experience the 1970s in America ourselves, that's really all it is, the movie companion to disco. But by breaking it down to its essentials, as we do on the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and then using the information as clues into the past, Saturday Night Fever is the story of a troubled young man, read society, who uses the garishness of the disco nightlife scene as a facade. As Kevin points out in the podcast, even the soundtrack offers clues to the psyche of Travolta's Tony Manero / the American public in the post-Vietnam and Watergate era. Just like Tony, the country was barely staying alive as the next decade approached. I can't thank you enough for making this come together. I want to say it's almost record time from me putting out feelers, being like, hey, anybody want to do a podcast? To then somebody saying yes. And then not only that, saying, here's our topic and let's go for it. So thank you, Kevin, for joining the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. Where can people find you and your podcast and other projects online?
So you can find me on Instagram at Kevin Liam Higgins, or you can find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can type in anchor.fm/I help make that, or just find my episodes on YouTube.
And just like this program itself, I think when you listen, watch and listen, however, you're going to get a much closer look, a much more scrutinized version of your favorite movies and TV shows. So I think our combined efforts here, me doing the Primary Source show and you doing the I Help Make That program, are doing a service to popular culture and media by digging in that much deeper. And so thank you again, Kevin, for joining the EPS podcast, where everything, including Saturday Night Fever, is a primary source.
You're welcome.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to the first half of my conversation with Kevin about Saturday Night Fever. If you'd like to hear more, head on over to patreon.com/EPS podcast. Become a patron today, and you'll hear the second half of this and several other episodes. You can do the same thing at epspodcast.substack.com, where the show notes are located, as well as a newsletter about the program. Otherwise, I hope to talk to you again soon at the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.